Portrait of the Saint by Brother John Marshall. Chapter 11. Husbands and Wives. As the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives also be to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 24 to 25, Revised Version. Throughout this letter, Paul has been filling in details in his portrait of the saint against a background of doctrine without which the portrait would never have been completed. Now he proceeds to apply the meaning and implications of this background. In effect, he says, "You know the truth, let your life manifest it." He introduces this practical application. "Look therefore carefully how you walk." Chapter 5, verses 15 to 21, Revised Version. "Pay careful heed to your behaviour," Bruce. "Live life, then, with a due sense of responsibility," Phillips. Paul means, of course, life as a whole, not just a part of it, for this is the life of the saint who must reflect the Spirit of God and the life of Christ in every act. Redeeming the time. Paul emphasizes his exhortation that saints should walk carefully, by adding not as unwise, that is, lacking in common sense, but as wise, as those who are skilful in imitating God in thought and action, redeeming the time because the days are evil. There is a suggestion here of seizing special opportunities, which may soon be gone, the sense of buying time while it lasts. We must never be idle spiritually. Every opportunity of service must be grasped. The time may come when we may bitterly regret that we allowed a chance to slip away. The saint's life to the end is ever active, never resting. It is the way we finish the life of imitation that counts. Jesus gave us an outstanding example of this when he prayed to his Father, "I have finished the work which thou gavest to me to do." John 17, verse 4. A lively and driving sense of spiritual purpose is vital to the saint. That is why Paul reinforces his exhortation by adding, "Wherefore be ye not foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." He obviously means what the will of the Lord is for you. Read in the context of what he has already written, "Proving what is well-pleasing unto the Lord," chapter 5, verse 10, we can understand what he means. Balance and contrast are favourite devices of Paul in his letters, and he uses both here. "Be not drunken with wine, but be filled with the Spirit." With the one, the outcome is likely to be riotous living. The parable of the prodigal son is but an ancient example of a modern and common experience. With the other, the outcome is one of joy in the knowledge and understanding of God's grace and bounty. A joy which leads to the saints speaking one to another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. Chapter 5, verse 19. Apart from the stimulus of singing with other saints, have we not at times felt a surge of joy in the eternal vision which is ours, which has brought a song of praise to our lips? Joy in affliction. Paul takes joy a stage further, into experiences which hardly seem appropriate for such an emotion. But what he says is of no mere counsel of perfection, but an expression of his own experience. Giving thanks always for all things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to God our Father. For sorrow, sickness, adversity. Yes, Paul meant what he said, for all things. The sense of this is seen in what he wrote elsewhere. I overflow with joy in all our affliction. The 2nd of Corinthians 7, verse 4. The life of the saint is not an easy one. We are deceived if we find tribulation unexpected and undeserved. Paul always strove to comfort those in tribulation, but he also counselled acceptance of trial. To them that love God, all things work together for good, even to them that are called according to his purpose. Romans 8, verse 28. We cannot accept the good with thanks and the bad with complaint, without harm to our spiritual welfare. Paul had found that certain experiences which he had rebelled against had ultimately worked to his and the gospel's advantage. Thus his advice is sound, giving thanks for all things. Paul closes his exhortation on the saint's walk by adding another piece of difficult advice. Subjecting yourselves one to another in the fear of Christ. Chapter 5, verse 21. This goes against the human grain. It is an affront to pride, and is particularly difficult for strong personalities. But was there ever a stronger personality than Jesus? If any man desire to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Mark 9, verse 35. Gird yourselves with humility to serve one another, said Peter. For God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace to the humble. 1 Peter 5, verse 5. Husband and wife. Now comes the practical application of this principle of being in subjection one to another in all the human and spiritual relationships which make up the sum of life. Paul begins with the relationship that should exist between husband and wife, each of whom should strive to be a pattern of the Father, from whom every family in heaven and earth is named. Chapter 3, verse 14. Of the importance and significance of marriage in the flesh, Jesus had spoken clearly and approvingly, quoting from Genesis 2, verse 24. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife. And the twain shall become one flesh. Matthew 19, verse 5. This union of flesh is not only natural, it is an experience of joy. Rejoice in the wife of thy youth, is the scripture injunction, for its most satisfying fruit is children who are a heritage of the Lord. In this letter Paul is writing for saints, and he is writing of a union which is not only one of flesh, but something added, something incomparably greater, a union of the Spirit. Because of the danger of troubles, of temperament, of incompatibilities, of selfishness and aggressiveness, to which flesh is heir, Paul wants the saints to realize what a profound union the marriage of saints is. As a community, we have probably given insufficient attention to Paul's exposition of marriage in the Lord. We have been so anxious to make sure that the doctrinal foundations of candidates for baptism are sound, that we have tended to overlook the moral and spiritual implications of the doctrine and their practical application to marriage. Paul has in mind the magnificent threefold relationship: God, the head of Christ, Christ, the head of the ecclesia, and the husband, head of the wife. That is why he writes, "Wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, as unto the Lord." Chapter 5, verse 22. The spiritual implications. To show the deep meaning of the spiritual union in marriage, Paul says that the husband is a figure of Christ, who is the head of the ecclesia, and the wife is a figure of the ecclesia, for which Christ gave his life. Both husband and wife must respect one another in this high spiritual sense, so that the husband will never selfishly dominate his wife, and the wife will never in self-pride lack respect for her husband. These spiritual implications of marriage are not incidental, they are preeminent. They call for a high sense of spiritual purpose in marriage, as well as an understanding of each other. If the wife is expected to respect her husband as a Christ-like figure, the husband must give his wife the same sort of love that Christ gave to the church when he sacrificed himself for her. Chapter 5, verse 25, Philip's. How many husbands and wives set out understandingly and deliberately to live their married life in this saintly pattern. When troubles arise between saints in marriage, they should examine not so much the temperamental or other personal causes which have led to a crisis. That is the way of the world. But each should examine his or her spiritual concept of marriage and of his or her responsibility for what has happened. When, time and again, saints in marriage try to solve difficulties by separation, divorce, or other means, they have done so by the device of treating marriage as a union of the flesh, thus keeping their married life in a kind of watertight compartment. Paul's whole argument is that this cannot be done in the life of the saint without serious damage to one's spiritual welfare. Of course, there have been cases where one partner has taken a step which has made the break inevitable, when that partner has made the break not only with the marriage, but with the truth. The whole purpose of God in writing this letter has been to expound the eternal principles which should guide the life of the believer and make his life a truly saintly one. What chance is there for the next generation if the pattern of the Christ life cannot be lived and seen in marriage partners? Paul asks for such a high spiritual response in husband and wife that there is a sense of equality in service, tempered by a measure of precedence. Christ was the Son of God, Lord over all. But did he emphasize this precedence? If I then, the Lord and the Master, have washed your feet, ye ought also to wash one another's feet. John 13, verse 14. This is the way the husband ought to exercise his precedence over the wife. This is the way the wife ought to respect her husband's role. This is the way they should love each other in the Spirit. A fresh look. Where relationships have become somewhat strained, the partners should try to take a fresh look at marriage, carefully reading this whole letter of Paul and catching from him the God's eye view of the saintly life, the divine quality which it enshrines, and the privilege a husband and wife have of reflecting this not only to the world, but to their children. If the husband takes precedence over the wife, he has a profound purpose to fulfill. It is likened to the sacrifice which Christ made for the ecclesia, in order that he might present it a glorious ecclesia, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. Chapter 5, verse 27. The purpose is no less than the attempt to exercise his precedence in such a saintly way that the life of his wife will be so profoundly affected by it that he can present her to his Lord holy and without blemish, that is, with no blemish that has been caused by his own unsaintliness. Marriage in the Lord is a wonderful experience for the saint. It is a high honour and a grave responsibility for the husband. It is an experience of even greater beauty for the wife, who can exercise so exquisitely acceptance of subjection to her husband and tactfully obedience to his will. Like the virtuous woman, the price of the wife is far above rubies. The heart of her husband trusteth in her, and he shall have no lack of gain. She doeth him good and not evil all the days of her life. Proverbs 31, verses 10 to 12. In marriage, then, is worked out the divine doctrine, the divine purpose, the godly pattern of saintly living. And Paul has done more than any other to express its meaning and its glory. This mystery is great, but I speak in regard of Christ and the Church. Chapter 5, verse 32. What greater revealed secret could there be of the saintly life than that the husband is symbolic of Christ and the wife is symbolic of the ecclesia? Portrait of the Saint, Chapter 12, Children and Parents. Honour thy father and mother, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 2 to 3. Is there a lovelier moment in the life of a woman than when, after her travail, she holds her first babe in her arms? Or a more satisfying experience for a man than when the growing babe stretches out its arms to him? Parenthood is a divine vocation, Ephesians 3, verses 14 to 15. As children are an heritage of the Lord, Psalm 127, verse 3. Parents have the responsibility of rearing children in the chastening and admonition of the Lord, Ephesians 6, verse 4. In chapter 5, Paul lifted marriage and the status of husband and wife above even the beauty of the union of the flesh. Now, in just a few verses, he raises the roles of parents and children above the level of human affection and sets them in the sphere of things in the Lord. He presents us with the portrait of the saint in yet another aspect. We live in an age in which children increasingly become disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, without self-control, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God. The 2nd of Timothy chapter 3, verse 2 to 4. These grievous things, as Paul pointed out to Timothy, would be a characteristic sign of the last days. But parents are partly to blame for such a situation. Instead of fully exercising their responsibilities for the nurture and discipline of their children, they willingly delegate control to the officers of the welfare state, rarely realizing the disastrous effects on family relationships. The modern state, by assuming control of the education, welfare, and health of children, emphasizes the dignity and responsibility of the individual. He is to stand on his own feet to such an extent that he virtually becomes an island. Thus, instead of close-knit families whose children readily turn to trusted parents in their troubles, there are now so many immature individuals at universities, college, or at work who, in their lonely distresses, when things go wrong, commit suicide, take to drink or drugs, or in rebellious haste tread in other ways the path to ruin. Parents and children in the Lord must resist this tragic tendency of the world around us, and remember at the centre of this vast universe is God the Father, and at his right hand of authority is his beloved Son. The whole conception of divine revelation is one of unity. In each family in the Lord, in the ecclesia, in the distance beyond the kingdom, when God will be all in all. The family is where children learn of this wondrous unity, and the ecclesia is where, in the larger society, they practice it. The love of parents. Parents wield their different and powerful influences on children, and as God is love, so the parents, particularly mother in the early stages, are the sources of love which should be a true reflection of the love of God with its understanding and compassion. As saints thrive on the love of God, so children thrive on the love of their parents, and where children feel secure in this love, so much the greater is their response to the instruction of the Father, and they will certainly forsake not the law of the mother. Proverbs 1, verse 8. Children fed on love and understanding find it easy to obey their parents in the Lord. Ephesians 6, verse 1. Parents have also to realize that to love children with abandon, giving them whatever they ask, withholding nothing and asserting no kind of discipline, is a wanton dereliction of responsibility to the heritage of the Lord. Deeds exercise a stronger influence than words on children, and example is more powerful than precept. And children who live in the spiritual atmosphere remain readily in subjection to their parents. 1 Timothy 3, verse 4 and 12. The spiritually selfless parents will lay up, treasure up for their children, and make certain that the material will not overbalance the spiritual. Something has gone wrong in family relationships if parents expect children to lay up for them. The 2 Corinthians 12, verse 14. A household where the truth has not been given first place, where habitual attendance at the meetings has not been a family affair, is a household which is likely to fall apart in the spiritual sense when children are old enough to make their own decisions. Parents have to lead honourable lives in spiritual things if they expect children to obey the commandment, "Honour thy father and mother," which is the first commandment with promise. And the children should remember that when they truly observe this commandment, the promise is the divine one, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. Ephesians 6, verse 3. If children have not learned to love selflessly as the result of the example of their parents, how can they so express themselves in the ecclesia? The spiritual life is made or marred in the home, and the ties of fellowship, particularly in God's eternal purposes, can be firmly forged in the unity of family life. Children are developing personalities and need all the love and skills of parents, particularly when they reach the teenage period. They need more careful handling and understanding. Intolerant parents are often those who have forgotten their own youth, or who are looking at the past through rose-tinted spectacles. Paul recognized the difficulties of dealing with growing children. Ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. It is so easy to tease and to stretch beyond the limits of control the self-conscious sensitivity of children. Parenthood is not an easy task today. To be loving yet firm, generous yet just, kind yet chastening, requires great wisdom, especially when children of families around them do not live in the atmosphere of the spiritual life. But children respect a fine and consistent example. They will take punishment without resentment, provided it is just, on the spot as far as possible, and not frequent. If the right kind of trusting confidence has been established between all the members of the family, children will unconsciously turn to their parents for advice and help in time of trouble, knowing that they will always find it. Is not this the God-like family? Importance of family life. Parents do not always realize how important family life is to children, and children do not always realize fully what it means to them. When the unity of the parents is broken, when they quarrel, or when they become estranged, if only for a short while, this can have a shattering effect on even teenage children. Their unhappiness can lead to delinquency, to a breakdown of attention at school, and even to nervous or physical illness. Parents must not play about with the Lord's heritage. Family life, particularly in the Lord, is a beautiful, tender, and precious experience. And if parents absorb the spirit of Paul's teaching on this aspect of the saint's life, there will be little wrong in our way of rearing children, and a great reward when the heritage of the Lord become the adopted sons of God. Ephesians 1 verse 5. Older children have the example of Jesus ever before them. He set his seal on parental authority when he censured the Pharisees who, by their subtle teaching, encouraged children to evade their duties to parents. Mark 7 verse 10 to 14. Above all, he showed his respect for parental control in his complete submission to Joseph and Mary at Nazareth. With all his knowledge, his consciousness of his call, and his communion with his Father, only once is it recorded that he temporarily disregarded his responsibility to them whilst he was about his Father's business. Otherwise he was loyally subject unto them. Luke 2 verse 51. The example of Jesus should teach children that they must never allow superior knowledge or enlightenment to mark their respect for parents, or cause them in any way to offend against the divine law. Rather, the family, through all its members, should reflect the glory of God, the Father, and Jesus the Son. Shortly before that moment when the world stood still and dark, before the greatest sacrifice of love, Jesus lifted family life to its highest pinnacle when, from the cross, he turned to his mother and said, "Woman, behold thy son." And to the faithful John who stood by he said, "Behold thy mother." May every parent and child always look to the cross, and remember Jesus who, at the time of his greatest extremity, was so faithful to his family ties as to make his mother's welfare his very last duty.